My name is Jessica Martinez, and at 32, I thought family meant everything until the day I discovered $2 million missing from my bank account. The same family who held my hand through months of physical therapy had emptied my settlement behind my back. What broke my heart wasn't just the stolen money, it was realizing that my own blood had been planning this betrayal while I was learning to walk again. But sometimes the darkest moments lead to the most unexpected allies. When attorney Michael Thompson showed up at my door at 9 p.m. on a Tuesday with a briefcase full of evidence and a plan for justice, everything changed. The wheelchair-bound woman who thought she had lost everything was about to discover just how powerful the truth could be. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Growing up in the heart of Phoenix, Arizona, I learned early that family loyalty wasn't just expected, it was sacred. Our modest ranch house in Glendale sat on a quiet street lined with palm trees and desert landscaping, where my father Frank Martinez had built a life through sheer determination and calloused hands. Dad worked construction for over 20 years, starting as a day laborer and eventually becoming a foreman for one of the city's most respected building companies. My mother Patricia, everyone called her Pat, managed the household finances with the precision of an accountant and the frugality of someone who had grown up with nothing. She clipped coupons religiously, shopped sales, and somehow managed to stretch Dad's paycheck to cover not just our family of four but also help support my grandmother who lived 3 blocks away. Pat worked part-time at a local pharmacy, mainly for the employee health insurance discount, but her real job was keeping our family afloat. My younger brother Tony was the golden child, the one who would carry on the Martinez name with pride. Dad had big dreams for Tony, picturing him taking over the construction business someday or maybe even starting his own company. Tony played along with these expectations, though I suspected he had different ideas about his future. He was smart, charismatic, and had a way of making everyone believe whatever he wanted them to believe. As the oldest child and only daughter, my role was different but equally defined. I was expected to be responsible, to help with household duties, to set a good example for Tony, and eventually to find a good husband who would treat me well and give my parents grandchildren. But I also wanted something more for myself. I had always been fascinated by healthcare, by the idea of helping people feel better, of being part of their healing process. After high school, I enrolled in the dental hygienist program at Phoenix College. It wasn't as prestigious as becoming a doctor or nurse, but it was a stable career that would allow me to support myself while still being able to help others. Dad wasn't thrilled about the student loans, but Mom convinced him that having a daughter with a professional job would reflect well on the family. The program was challenging but rewarding. I loved the precision required, the patient interaction, the feeling that I was making a real difference in people's oral health and overall well-being. During my clinical rotations, I discovered I had a particular talent for working with nervous patients, especially children and elderly folks who had dental anxiety. My supervisors often commented on my patience and gentle touch. After graduation, I landed a position at Desert Smile Dental, a busy practice in Tempe that served a diverse clientele. Dr. Sarah Chen, the practice owner, was a mentor who encouraged my professional development and treated her staff with respect and fairness. The work was steady, the pay was decent, and I felt like I was building towards something meaningful. My personal life was equally stable. I had been dating David Chen, Dr. Chen's younger brother, for about 8 months. David worked in tech support for a software company and shared my appreciation for quiet evenings, hiking in the desert, and trying new restaurants around Phoenix. He was kind, dependable, and got along well with my family, which meant everything to my parents. We had talked about moving in together, maybe getting engaged within the next year or 2. Nothing dramatic or rushed, just the natural progression of 2 people who enjoyed each other's company and shared similar values about work, family, and building a life together. David had even started joining us for Sunday dinners at my parents' house, where Mom would fuss over him and Dad would discuss construction projects and neighborhood politics. Life felt predictable in the best possible way. I had a career I enjoyed, a relationship that was heading somewhere positive, and a close-knit family that supported each other through everything. We weren't wealthy, but we were comfortable. We weren't glamorous, but we were happy. The Martinez family had found their rhythm, and it seemed like nothing could disrupt the steady progress we were all making toward our individual and collective goals. Tony had graduated from Arizona State University with a business degree and was working for a marketing firm in Scottsdale. He had recently gotten engaged to Rebecca, a cheerful woman who worked as an elementary school teacher and fit seamlessly into our family dynamic. Rebecca loved Mom's cooking, helped with holiday preparations, and seemed genuinely excited about becoming a Martinez. The wedding was planned for the following spring, and my parents were already saving money for what they hoped would be a celebration worthy of their son's achievement. Dad had even mentioned the possibility of giving Tony and Rebecca a down payment for a
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
house as a wedding gift, though I knew this would require significant financial sacrifice from my parents. Our Sunday family dinners had become a cherished tradition, gathering around Mom's dining room table to share both food and updates about our week. Dad would talk about his current construction projects, the challenges of managing crews and dealing with demanding clients. Mom would update us on neighborhood gossip and share stories from the pharmacy. Tony would entertain us with tales from his marketing job, and Rebecca would tell funny stories about her second-grade students. I would contribute updates about interesting patients at the dental office, always being careful to maintain confidentiality while sharing the human moments that made my work meaningful. David, when he joined us, would listen more than he spoke, but his quiet presence added a sense of completeness to our family circle. These dinners represented everything I valued about family life. The consistency, the mutual support, the shared laughter, the way we could count on each other no matter what challenges arose. Dad would always say grace, thanking God for bringing us together safely another week, for the food Mom had prepared, and for the blessings we sometimes took for granted. Looking back now, I realize how naive I was to believe that family loyalty was unconditional, that the people who claimed to love you would never deliberately harm you for their own gain. I thought our shared history, our mutual struggles and celebrations had created bonds that couldn't be broken by something as crude as money. The construction industry in Phoenix was booming during this period, with new housing developments and commercial projects creating plenty of work for experienced crews. Dad's company had recently won a contract for a luxury resort expansion in Scottsdale, a project that would keep his team busy for at least 18 months. He was proud of this contract, seeing it as validation of his expertise and reputation in the industry. Dad had always been safety conscious on his job sites, understanding that construction work carried inherent risks that required constant vigilance and proper protocols. He insisted his crews wear appropriate protective equipment, follow safety guidelines, and never cut corners that might endanger someone's life or health. His reputation for running safe, efficient projects was part of what made him valuable to his employers. The resort project was particularly complex, involving both renovation of existing structures and construction of new facilities. Dad was responsible for coordinating multiple subcontractors, ensuring that electrical, plumbing, and architectural work proceeded according to schedule while maintaining the highest safety standards. It was the kind of project that could make or break a foreman's career, and Dad approached it with his usual combination of professionalism and personal pride. I remember him coming home from work during those weeks leading up to the accident, tired but energized by the challenges of the project. He would describe the progress they were making, the problems they had solved, the satisfaction of seeing something substantial take shape through coordinated effort and skilled craftsmanship. Mom would listen to these work stories with a mixture of pride and concern, always worrying about Dad's safety but understanding that construction was more than just a job for him. It was his identity, his contribution to building the community we all lived in. When we drove around Phoenix and Dad pointed out buildings he had helped construct, we all felt a sense of family accomplishment. The morning of March 15th started like any other Tuesday. Dad left for work at 6:30, coffee cup in hand, lunch packed by Mom, kissing her goodbye with the casual affection of a couple married for 35 years. I was getting ready for my early shift at the dental office, running through my usual routine of checking my schedule, gathering my supplies, and mentally preparing for the day ahead. The call came at 11:27 a.m. I remember the exact time because I was in the middle of a routine cleaning for Mrs. Rodriguez, a sweet elderly patient who always asked about my family. When my phone rang, I almost ignored it, since we weren't supposed to take personal calls during patient appointments. But something made me glance at the screen, and when I saw Mom's name, I knew immediately that something was wrong. Mom never called during work hours unless it was an emergency. Her voice was shaking so badly I could barely understand her words at first. There had been an accident at Dad's job site, a crane malfunction. Multiple people injured. Dad was being taken to Banner Desert Medical Center. She needed me to meet her there right away. I excused myself from Mrs. Rodriguez, quickly explaining the situation to Dr. Chen and drove to the hospital with my hands trembling on the steering wheel. During that 20-minute drive through Phoenix traffic, I prayed harder than I had since childhood, making bargains with God about what I would give up if only Dad would be okay. The emergency room was chaos when I arrived. Multiple construction workers had been brought in, and their families were gathering in the waiting area with the same mixture of fear and desperate hope I was feeling. Mom was already there, still wearing her pharmacy uniform, clutching her purse like it might anchor her to something solid in a world that had suddenly become unpredictable. Tony arrived about 10 minutes after me, having left his marketing job in Scottsdale the moment Mom called him. Rebecca came straight from her school, still wearing the colorful teaching clothes that seemed incongruous in the sterile hospital environment. David showed up within the hour, having heard the news from his sister Dr. Chen, bringing coffee and sandwiches that none of us could eat. The waiting was the worst part. Hours passed before anyone could give us concrete information about Dad's condition. We learned that a crane had malfunctioned during a routine lift, sending a load of steel beams crashing into the area where Dad's crew was working. 3 men had been seriously injured, and Dad had taken the worst of it, suffering massive internal injuries and trauma to his spine. When the surgeon finally came to speak with us, his expression told us everything before he said a word. Dad had died on the operating table, despite their best efforts to save him. The internal bleeding had been too severe, the trauma too extensive for even the most skilled medical team to overcome. But there was more devastating news. I had been on my way to the job site that morning to bring Dad some paperwork he had forgotten at home. I was crossing the construction area when the crane malfunctioned, and falling debris had struck me as well. The impact had shattered 3 vertebrae in my lower back and caused significant nerve damage that would require months of surgery and rehabilitation. I don't remember much about the immediate aftermath of learning this information. The shock was too overwhelming, the loss too profound to process all at once. My father was dead, and I was facing the possibility of permanent disability, all because of a mechanical failure that should never have happened. The next few weeks passed in a blur of funeral arrangements, medical consultations, and the beginning of what would become a very long legal battle. Dad's employer was clearly at fault for the crane malfunction, which investigation revealed was caused by inadequate maintenance and inspection protocols. The other injured workers were also pursuing legal action, and it became clear that this was a case of corporate negligence that had cost my father his life and left me with injuries that would change everything about my future. My family rallied around me during those early days of grief and uncertainty. Mom practically lived at the hospital during my initial recovery, sleeping in the uncomfortable bedside chair and advocating fiercely with doctors and nurses about my care. Tony took time off work to handle funeral arrangements and deal with insurance paperwork. Rebecca organized meal trains and coordinated visits from friends and extended family. David was equally supportive, adjusting his work schedule to spend time at the hospital and researching spinal injury rehabilitation programs. He never once suggested that my injuries would change our relationship or our future plans together. Instead, he seemed determined to learn everything he could about my condition so he could be the best possible partner during my recovery. The outpouring of support from our community was overwhelming. Dad's construction crew attended the funeral in their work clothes, having driven straight from other job sites to pay their respects. Neighbors brought casseroles and flowers. My co-workers at the dental office had collected money to help with medical expenses and lost wages during my recovery. But beneath all this love and support, I was struggling with anger and despair that felt almost too large to contain. Dad was gone forever, and I was facing the possibility that I might never walk normally again, might never be able to return to my career as a dental hygienist, might never be able to live the independent life I had worked so hard to build. The physical rehabilitation was brutal, requiring hours of daily physical therapy that pushed my body to its absolute limits. Some days the pain was so intense I couldn't imagine continuing the process, but the alternative was accepting permanent paralysis, which I refused to consider. My physical therapist, Lisa Wong, became both my coach and my counselor, pushing me to achieve small victories while helping me process the emotional trauma of everything I had lost. During those long months of recovery, my family's support never wavered. They took turns driving me to medical appointments, helped me navigate the complex world of insurance claims and disability benefits, and maintained optimism about my eventual recovery, even when I couldn't summon hope for myself. It was during this period that we first met attorney Michael Thompson, the personal injury lawyer, who would eventually become our strongest advocate for justice. Thompson specialized in construction accident cases and had a reputation for taking on large corporations that prioritized profits over worker safety. Our initial consultation with Thompson was both encouraging and sobering. He explained that we had a strong case for both wrongful death compensation for Dad and personal injury damages for my ongoing medical needs and lost future earnings. However, he also warned us that these cases could take years to resolve, and that the defendants would likely fight every aspect of our claims. Thompson's approach was methodical and thorough, investigating every aspect of the crane malfunction and the company's safety protocols. He hired expert witnesses, reviewed maintenance records, and interviewed other workers who had expressed concerns about equipment safety prior to the accident. The evidence he compiled painted a clear picture of corporate negligence that had created the conditions for this preventable tragedy. As my physical recovery progressed slowly but steadily, the legal case became a source of hope for our family's future. The potential settlement wouldn't bring Dad back or erase my injuries, but it would provide financial security and ensure that the company faced consequences for their negligence. More importantly, it might prevent similar accidents from happening to other families. Thompson explained that construction accident settlements often reached significant amounts, particularly in cases involving death and permanent disability. While he couldn't guarantee specific outcomes, he estimated that our combined claims could result in a settlement in the millions of dollars, enough to cover my ongoing medical expenses and provide some measure of financial security for the rest of my life. This possibility created a strange mixture of emotions for our family. None of us wanted money to be the focus when we were grieving Dad's death and dealing with my injuries, but we also recognized that financial resources would be crucial for my long-term care and independence. The settlement represented both justice for what had been taken from us and practical hope for rebuilding our lives in the aftermath of tragedy. As the legal process moved forward and my physical recovery continued, I began to believe that we might actually emerge from this devastating experience with some measure of healing and closure. My family had proven their loyalty and love through months of support, and it seemed like we were moving toward a resolution that would honor Dad's memory while securing my future. I had no idea that this same family, who had held my hand through the darkest period of my life, was already planning to betray me in ways I could never have imagined. The first real warning sign came disguised as concern for my well-being. About 6 months into my recovery, when I was finally able to walk short distances with a walker and had returned to limited work at the dental office, Mom suggested it might be wise to add her name to my bank accounts. Just temporarily, she explained, in case I needed help managing finances during my ongoing medical treatments. Her reasoning seemed logical at the time. I was still dealing with cognitive fog from pain medications, struggling to keep track of multiple medical appointments, insurance claims, and the mountain of paperwork that seemed to multiply daily. Having Mom help with bill paying and financial organization felt like a practical solution that would reduce my stress during recovery. Tony supported this suggestion enthusiastically, pointing out that Mom had always been the family's financial manager and had successfully handled Dad's insurance benefits and funeral expenses. He reminded me how overwhelmed I had become trying to coordinate medical bills with insurance payments, often making errors that resulted in duplicate charges or missed deadlines for reimbursement claims. David was less enthusiastic about the idea, suggesting instead that we could hire a professional bookkeeper or financial advisor to help manage my affairs during recovery. But Mom seemed hurt by this suggestion, as if David was implying she couldn't be trusted with family finances. She reminded us that she had been managing money successfully for decades and had never made any significant errors with the family budget. Not wanting to appear ungrateful for all the support my family had provided, and genuinely needing help with financial management during my recovery, I agreed to add Mom as a joint account holder on my checking and savings accounts. It seemed like a reasonable temporary arrangement that would make everyone's life easier, while I focused on getting stronger and returning to normal function. The bank appointment to add Mom to my accounts was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon, when I had a break between physical therapy and a follow-up appointment with my orthopedic surgeon. Mom drove me to the appointment, chatting cheerfully about Rebecca's wedding planning and Tony's recent promotion at his marketing firm. She seemed genuinely excited about being able to help me with financial management, describing it as one more way she could support my recovery process. The bank manager, Mrs. Peterson, explained the joint account process thoroughly, making sure I understood that adding another person as a joint holder would give them full access to deposit and withdraw funds. Mom would be able to write checks, make electronic transfers, and access the accounts online just as if the money belonged to her. Mrs. Peterson also mentioned that joint accounts could have implications for estate planning and taxes, suggesting I might want to consult with a financial advisor about the long-term consequences. Mom dismissed these concerns with a laugh, explaining to Mrs. Peterson that this was just a temporary arrangement to help during my recovery period. She assured both of us that she had no intention of accessing my accounts except when necessary to help pay medical bills or handle other expenses related to my care. Her tone was so reasonable and loving that Mrs. Peterson's cautious expression softened into a smile. I signed the paperwork, adding Mom as a joint account holder, feeling grateful to have such dedicated family support during this challenging time. At that moment, my checking account held about $15,000 in savings, plus my regular paychecks from the dental office. My savings account had approximately $8,000 that I had been accumulating for a down payment on a house before the accident changed all my plans. Over the following months, Mom did indeed help with financial management in exactly the ways she had promised. She organized my medical bills, coordinated with insurance companies to resolve payment disputes, and maintained detailed records of all expenses related to my recovery. Her system was more thorough and efficient than anything I had managed on my own, and I felt genuine relief knowing that this aspect of my life was being handled competently. Tony also became more involved in family financial discussions during this period, often stopping by Mom's house to review household budgets and help with financial planning. He had always been good with numbers and had learned sophisticated financial analysis techniques through his business degree and marketing work. His involvement seemed natural and helpful, particularly since Mom was taking on additional responsibilities by managing my accounts. Rebecca proved to be surprisingly knowledgeable about insurance and medical billing, having dealt with complex paperwork through her teaching job's health benefits. She often joined our family financial discussions, offering suggestions about maximizing insurance reimbursements and organizing medical expense documentation for tax purposes. Her contribution felt valuable and demonstrated how seamlessly she was integrating into our family structure. These family financial meetings became a regular Sunday evening activity, taking place after our traditional dinner, but before everyone went home for the week. We would spread paperwork across Mom's dining room table, with each person taking responsibility for different aspects of the financial management process. It felt collaborative and supportive, like we were all working together to navigate the complex aftermath of Dad's death and my ongoing recovery. David occasionally expressed mild concern about the level of family involvement in my financial affairs, suggesting that I might want to maintain more independence in managing my own money. But his concerns seemed to stem from general principles about financial autonomy, rather than any specific suspicion about my family's motives. He trusted my judgment about family dynamics, and didn't want to cause conflict by pushing too hard against arrangements that seemed to be working well. Attorney Thompson's case preparation continued steadily throughout this period, with regular updates about depositions, expert witness testimony, and settlement negotiations. The evidence supporting our claims was overwhelming, and Thompson expressed confidence that we would achieve a substantial settlement that would reflect both the wrongful death damages for Dad and the long-term medical expenses and lost earnings related to my injuries. The potential settlement amounts Thompson discussed were larger than anything my family had ever contemplated. He estimated that the combined claims could result in a settlement between $2 and $3 million, depending on how aggressively the defendants chose to fight the case. This money would need to cover my medical expenses for the rest of my life, compensate for reduced earning capacity due to my injuries, and provide some measure of compensation for the pain and suffering we had all endured. These settlement discussions created a strange atmosphere in our family. None of us wanted to seem greedy or focused on money when we were still grieving Dad's death, but we also couldn't ignore the practical reality that this settlement would fundamentally change our family's financial situation. Mom and Tony began making casual references to things they might do once the settlement came through, though always in the context of how the money might benefit my long-term care and security. Tony mentioned that he and Rebecca were considering postponing their house purchase until after the settlement, when they might be able to afford something larger that could accommodate my needs if I ever wanted to live with family again. Mom talked about possibly renovating her house to make it more wheelchair accessible, in case I needed to move back home during any future medical crises. These discussions seemed caring and forward-thinking, focused on family unity and mutual support. Rebecca suggested that some of the settlement money might be invested in business opportunities that could provide ongoing income for my long-term financial security. Tony's marketing experience had exposed him to various investment possibilities, and he thought there might be ways to leverage the settlement into even greater financial stability. Their suggestions seemed motivated by genuine concern for my future rather than any desire to access the money for their own purposes. As my physical recovery progressed and I became more independent in daily activities, I began to think about reducing my family's involvement in my financial management. The joint bank accounts had served their purpose during the most difficult period of my recovery, but I was now capable of handling bill paying and financial organization on my own. I mentioned this possibility during one of our Sunday evening financial meetings, suggesting that we might want to transition back to separate accounts once the settlement was finalized. Mom's reaction to this suggestion was subtle but noticeable. She didn't object directly, but she pointed out how complex the settlement process would be and how many financial decisions would need to be made about investing and managing such a large amount of money. She suggested that maintaining family involvement in financial management might be wise even after the settlement, particularly since none of us had experience handling such substantial sums. Tony supported Mom's perspective, arguing that family financial planning had worked well during my recovery and might continue to be beneficial for managing settlement funds. He pointed out that his business background and Mom's careful money management skills could help ensure that the settlement money was protected and invested wisely for my long-term benefit. Rebecca agreed, noting that managing a large settlement would be much more complex than handling regular personal finances. David was the only person who expressed support for my desire to regain full control of my finances, but even he acknowledged that managing a multi-million-dollar settlement would require professional guidance that I might not be prepared to handle alone. His suggestion was that I should hire a professional financial advisor rather than relying on family members, but this recommendation seemed to create tension with my family members who had invested so much time and energy in helping with my financial affairs. Not wanting to appear ungrateful or create family conflict, I agreed to postpone any changes to our financial management arrangements until after the settlement was finalized. This decision seemed reasonable at the time, since the settlement negotiations were still ongoing and we didn't yet know exactly how much money would be involved or what specific financial decisions would need to be made. During the months leading up to the settlement, I noticed small changes in my family's behavior that didn't seem significant individually, but created a pattern of increasing financial control over my life. Mom began making more financial decisions without consulting me first, explaining afterward that she had needed to handle urgent bills or take advantage of time-sensitive opportunities. Tony started giving me detailed advice about spending decisions, suggesting that I should be more careful about expenses while we were waiting for the settlement to be finalized. Rebecca began asking specific questions about my income and expenses, ostensibly to help with financial planning but with a level of detail that seemed unnecessary for someone who wasn't directly involved in managing my money. David noticed these changes and mentioned them to me privately, but I dismissed his concerns as oversensitivity to normal family dynamics during a stressful period. The most significant change was in the frequency and tone of family discussions about the pending settlement. What had initially been careful, respectful conversations about my future financial security gradually became more detailed planning sessions about how the money might be used for various family purposes. Tony began presenting elaborate investment scenarios that would benefit everyone in the family, while Mom made increasingly specific suggestions about how I should structure my financial affairs for maximum tax advantages. These conversations always maintained the pretense that everything was being planned for my benefit, but the level of detail and the assumptions about family involvement in major financial decisions began to feel overwhelming. I started to feel like the settlement money was being treated as a family resource rather than compensation for my personal losses and ongoing medical needs. Attorney Thompson scheduled a meeting for early December to discuss the final settlement negotiations. The defendants had agreed to a settlement amount of $2.4 million, which Thompson considered an excellent outcome given the strength of our case and the specific circumstances of the accident. The settlement would be structured as a lump sum payment, with the money transferred to my accounts within 30 days of finalizing the legal paperwork. I was thrilled by this news, seeing the settlement as validation that justice had been served and that my future financial security was assured. The amount was larger than Thompson's most optimistic projections, and it represented enough money to cover my medical expenses, replace my lost earning capacity, and provide a comfortable standard of living for the rest of my life. When I shared this news with my family during our Sunday dinner, their reaction was enthusiastic but also somehow different than I had expected. Instead of focusing on what this meant for my personal recovery and independence, the conversation immediately turned to specific plans for managing and investing the money. Tony had prepared detailed spreadsheets showing various investment options, while Mom had researched tax strategies for minimizing the financial impact of receiving such a large settlement. Rebecca suggested that we should all meet with a financial advisor together, as a family, to make sure everyone understood the best approaches for managing the settlement money. Her suggestion felt reasonable on the surface, but something about the assumption that the entire family would be involved in major financial decisions about my settlement money felt uncomfortable in a way I couldn't quite articulate. David's reaction was the most concerning. When I told him privately about the settlement amount, his first response was excitement and relief for my financial security. But when I described the family's detailed planning discussions, his expression became more serious. He pointed out that my family seemed to be making a lot of assumptions about their continued involvement in managing money that was specifically intended to compensate me for my losses. His observation forced me to consider whether my family's helpful financial management during my recovery had gradually evolved into something more controlling and presumptuous. The joint bank accounts that had seemed like a practical solution during my medical crisis were now positioned as the foundation for ongoing family financial management that might continue indefinitely. For the first time since the accident, I began to question whether my family's motives were as purely supportive as I had believed. The settlement money represented my financial independence and security, but my family's plans seemed to assume that this independence would be managed and controlled by them rather than by me. The realization that I might need to choose between family harmony and personal financial autonomy was deeply unsettling. As the settlement paperwork moved toward finalization, I found myself in the uncomfortable position of needing to assert boundaries with the same family members who had supported me through the most difficult period of my life. The money that was supposed to represent justice and security was becoming a source of tension and conflict that threatened to damage the family relationships I valued most. The stage was set for confrontations that would reveal the true nature of my family's support and force me to choose between maintaining family peace and protecting my own financial future. The settlement that should have marked the end of my legal struggles was about to become the beginning of a much more personal and painful battle for control over my own life. The settlement check arrived on a crisp January morning, delivered by certified mail to Attorney Thompson's office. I'll never forget the surreal feeling of holding that piece of paper worth $2.4 million, knowing it represented both my father's life and my own shattered body. Thompson handled the deposit process with professional efficiency, but I could see the satisfaction in his eyes. After 18 months of legal battles, we had achieved something that felt like justice. The money was transferred into my primary checking account on January 15th, a date I had circled on my calendar for weeks. That morning, I logged into my online banking with trembling fingers, hardly believing the number that appeared on my screen. For someone who had grown up counting every dollar, seeing 7 figures in my account balance felt almost fictional, like I was looking at someone else's financial information by mistake. I called Mom immediately to share the news, and within an hour, our entire family had gathered at her house to celebrate this milestone moment. Tony brought champagne, Rebecca had picked up a cake from the bakery, and David arrived with flowers and a genuine smile that reached his eyes. For those first few hours, the settlement felt like pure victory, a vindication of everything we had endured, and a promise of financial security I had never dared to imagine. Mom suggested we spend the evening making concrete plans for managing the money wisely. She had prepared a folder full of research about investment options, tax implications, and strategies for protecting large settlements from potential financial risks. Her thoroughness impressed everyone, and I felt grateful once again for having such a financially responsible mother who was willing to help navigate these uncharted waters. Tony unveiled the investment presentation he had been working on for weeks, complete with colorful charts and projected returns on various financial instruments. His business background had given him access to sophisticated investment tools and analysis software that none of the rest of us understood. The presentation looked professional and convincing, full of terms like diversified portfolios, municipal bonds, and conservative growth strategies that sounded exactly like what a responsible person should do with a large settlement. Rebecca had researched tax strategies for managing substantial windfalls, discovering that there were specific approaches for minimizing the tax burden on settlement payments. Her research suggested that certain types of investments and financial structures could significantly reduce the amount of taxes I would owe on the settlement money. The potential savings she had identified were substantial enough to justify hiring professional tax advisors to implement these strategies properly. David listened to all these presentations with polite attention, but I could sense his discomfort with the level of detail and specificity in my family's planning. When Mom suggested that we should all meet with a financial advisor together the following week, David quietly asked if I was comfortable with making such major financial decisions so quickly after receiving the settlement. His question seemed reasonable, but it created an awkward silence in the room. Tony responded to David's concern by pointing out that investment opportunities and tax strategies were time-sensitive, and that delaying important financial decisions could cost significant money in missed opportunities or increase tax liability. Mom agreed, adding that the sooner we established proper financial management systems, the better protected the settlement money would be from inflation, market volatility, and other risks that could erode its value over time. Their arguments sounded logical and well-researched, but something about the urgency felt uncomfortable. I had waited 18 months for this settlement, and the idea that I needed to make major investment decisions within days of receiving the money seemed unnecessarily rushed. However, I didn't want to appear ungrateful for my family's obvious preparation and hard work on my behalf. The financial advisor meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday at a prestigious investment firm in downtown Phoenix. Tony had arranged the appointment through a colleague who specialized in serving high-net-worth clients, and the advisor, Robert Mitchell, had impressive credentials and experience managing large portfolios for successful professionals and business owners. Mitchell's office was intimidating in its obvious expense, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, leather furniture that probably cost more than my annual salary, and diplomas and awards covering one entire wall. When we arrived for our appointment, Mitchell greeted my family with the polished professionalism of someone accustomed to dealing with substantial sums of money. The presentation Mitchell had prepared was even more sophisticated than Tony's research, with detailed analysis of market trends, risk assessment models, and projected returns on various investment strategies. He recommended a diversified approach that would split the settlement money between conservative investments for security, moderate risk investments for steady growth, and a smaller portion in higher risk investments for potential significant returns. Mitchell's recommendations seemed sound and professional, but I was surprised by how much of the discussion focused on family financial planning, rather than my individual needs and goals. He seemed to assume that the settlement money would be managed as part of a broader family financial strategy, with Mom and Tony playing significant roles in major investment decisions. When I asked about maintaining individual control over my settlement funds, Mitchell acknowledged that this was certainly possible, but suggested that family-based financial planning often achieved better results through coordinated investment strategies and shared financial expertise. He pointed out that my family had demonstrated remarkable financial responsibility and knowledge throughout our meeting, making them valuable partners in managing such a substantial portfolio. Mom and Tony both expressed enthusiasm for Mitchell's collaborative approach, emphasizing their commitment to helping me achieve the best possible financial outcomes from the settlement. Rebecca noted that coordinated financial planning could also provide tax advantages and risk management benefits that might not be available through individual investment strategies. David remained quiet throughout most of the meeting, but when Mitchell asked if there were any concerns or questions about the proposed approach, David mentioned that I might want to take some time to consider these recommendations before making any major commitments. His suggestion seemed to surprise Mitchell, who pointed out that market conditions were particularly favorable for implementing these strategies immediately. Tony supported Mitchell's timeline recommendations, explaining that his business experience had taught him the importance of acting decisively when investment opportunities presented themselves. Mom agreed, adding that delaying investment decisions would mean leaving the settlement money in low-interest checking accounts, where inflation would gradually erode its purchasing power. Their points seemed financially sound, but the pressure to make immediate decisions about such a large amount of money felt overwhelming. I requested a few days to review all the materials and discuss the options with David privately before making any final commitments. Mitchell seemed slightly disappointed by this request, but agreed to schedule a follow-up meeting for the following week. During the drive home from the financial advisor meeting, my family's conversation revealed more specific expectations about ongoing financial management than I had previously understood. Mom mentioned that she would need access to investment accounts to help monitor performance and coordinate tax planning activities. Tony discussed the importance of family meetings to review investment performance and make strategic adjustments based on changing market conditions. Rebecca suggested that coordinated family financial planning would require regular communication about spending decisions and major purchases to ensure that individual financial choices aligned with overall investment strategies. The level of ongoing family involvement in my financial affairs that they were describing seemed much more extensive than I had anticipated when we first established joint bank accounts during my recovery. That evening, David and I discussed the financial advisor meeting privately for the first time since receiving the settlement. David expressed concerns that my family seemed to be making assumptions about long-term control over my financial decisions that went beyond the temporary assistance they had provided during my medical recovery. He pointed out that the investment strategies being proposed would effectively tie up my settlement money in complex financial instruments that would require ongoing professional management. David's observations forced me to consider whether my family's financial planning discussions had gradually shifted from helping me manage my money to controlling how my money was managed. The investment strategies being proposed were sophisticated and potentially beneficial, but they would also create financial structures that would be difficult to change without family consensus and professional assistance. I spent the weekend reviewing all the financial materials my family had prepared and researching investment options independently. The more I learned about portfolio management and investment strategies, the more I realized that there were many different approaches to managing a large settlement, not all of which required extensive family involvement or immediate implementation of complex investment structures. My independent research revealed that many financial advisors recommended taking time to adjust to sudden wealth before making major investment decisions. Several articles suggested that settlement recipients often benefited from maintaining liquid assets for at least 6 months while they processed the emotional aspects of their new financial situation and developed clear personal goals for how they wanted to use their money. This information conflicted with the urgency my family had emphasized about immediate investment decisions. When I mentioned these alternative perspectives during our next family financial meeting, Mom and Tony seemed frustrated by what they characterized as unnecessarily cautious advice that could cost significant investment returns. Tony presented additional research showing how much money could be lost by keeping large sums in checking accounts rather than investing them immediately in growing markets. Mom pointed out that the longer I delayed making investment decisions, the more I would pay in taxes on the settlement money and the less purchasing power the money would have due to inflation. Their arguments were compelling and backed by specific financial data, but I was beginning to feel pressured to make decisions based on their timeline rather than my own comfort level. The settlement money was supposed to provide security and independence, but the financial planning process was making me feel more dependent on my family's expertise and less confident in my ability to make autonomous decisions about my own money. Rebecca suggested that my concerns about timeline and family involvement might be resolved by establishing clear agreements about decision-making authority and regular review processes for investment performance. She proposed creating written documents that would specify exactly how family financial planning would work and what my individual rights and responsibilities would be within that structure. Her suggestion seemed reasonable and addressed some of my concerns about maintaining autonomy while benefiting from family financial expertise. However, the idea of creating formal agreements about how my settlement money would be managed reinforced my growing sense that this money was being treated as a family asset rather than my personal compensation for devastating losses. The pressure to make immediate financial decisions intensified when Mitchell called to schedule our follow-up meeting. He mentioned that the investment opportunities he had identified were time-sensitive and that delaying implementation much longer could result in missing optimal market conditions for establishing my portfolio. Mom and Tony both encouraged me to move forward with Mitchell's recommendations, emphasizing the professional credibility of his firm and the sophisticated analysis behind his investment strategies. They pointed out that I had already spent a week reviewing the materials and that further delay would be financially counterproductive. David suggested that I might want to consult with a different financial advisor independently before making such major commitments. His recommendation created obvious tension with my family, who had invested significant time and energy in researching options and coordinating with Mitchell's firm. Tony responded to David's suggestion with barely concealed irritation, pointing out that second-guessing professional financial advice could lead to missed opportunities and unnecessary complications. Mom added that seeking multiple opinions about investment strategies often resulted in conflicting recommendations that made decision-making more difficult rather than easier. Their reactions to David's reasonable suggestion for independent consultation made me realize how invested my family had become in the specific financial planning approach they had researched. What had begun as helpful support during my recovery had evolved into a coordinated effort to direct my financial decisions according to their preferences rather than my own careful consideration. The follow-up meeting with Mitchell was scheduled for the following Tuesday, and my family expected me to move forward with implementing the investment strategies we had discussed. The pressure to make this commitment felt overwhelming, particularly since I was still processing the emotional reality of having such a large amount of money and wasn't entirely comfortable with how quickly my family wanted to tie up these funds in complex financial instruments. As the meeting approached, I found myself in the uncomfortable position of needing to choose between disappointing my family and making financial decisions I wasn't fully comfortable with. The settlement that was supposed to represent my independence and security was becoming a source of family conflict and pressure that I hadn't anticipated. The stage was set for a confrontation that would reveal whether my family's financial planning efforts were truly focused on my best interests or whether they had developed their own agenda for how my settlement money should be managed. The decision I made about moving forward with their investment recommendations would determine not only my financial future but also the nature of my ongoing relationship with family members who had supported me through crisis but now seemed determined to control the benefits of my legal victory. The Tuesday morning meeting with Mitchell never happened because on Monday night I discovered that my settlement money was gone. All $2.4 million had vanished from my account, leaving behind a balance of $312.47. The shock was so complete that I stared at my computer screen for nearly 10 minutes, refreshing the browser repeatedly, convinced there had to be some kind of technical error with the bank's website. When the numbers remained the same after multiple refreshes, I called the bank's customer service line with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. The representative confirmed what the screen was showing me, but couldn't provide details about where the money had gone over the phone. She scheduled an emergency appointment for me to meet with a bank manager the following morning to review the account activity in person. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat at my kitchen table with David, going through every piece of financial paperwork I could find, trying to understand how such a massive amount of money could disappear without my knowledge or authorization. David helped me organize bank statements, investment documents, and legal papers, but nothing we found explained the missing funds. The meeting at the bank revealed the devastating truth. Between January 16 and February 2, a series of electronic transfers had moved the entire settlement amount out of my checking account in carefully orchestrated increments. The transfers had been initiated using the online banking credentials for the joint account, and each transaction bore the digital signature authorization that Mom had established when she was added as an account holder. Mrs. Peterson, the same bank manager who had helped establish the joint accounts, reviewed the transaction history with obvious discomfort. She explained that all the transfers appeared to be legitimate from a banking perspective, since they had been initiated by an authorized account holder using proper security credentials. The bank had no obligation to notify me about transactions initiated by joint account holders, even for such large amounts. The money had been transferred to 3 different accounts. $1.2 million had gone to an investment account that Tony had opened at Mitchell's firm, ostensibly for my benefit, but structured in a way that gave him significant control over withdrawals and investment decisions. $800,000 had been transferred to a real estate investment account that Mom had established, apparently to purchase rental properties that would generate income for my long-term financial security. The remaining $400,000 had been moved to what appeared to be a family trust account that listed Mom, Tony, and Rebecca as trustees, with authority to make distributions for my care and support. According to the bank records, this trust had been established several weeks earlier, around the same time that my family had been researching investment strategies and tax planning approaches. Mrs. Peterson provided me with copies of all the transfer authorizations and account opening documents. The paperwork revealed a level of financial planning and legal preparation that must have taken weeks to coordinate. Every transfer had been structured to appear legitimate and beneficial, with documentation that described each account as being established for my financial security and long-term care needs. The investment account documents included detailed projections showing how the invested funds would grow over time, providing income for my medical expenses and living costs throughout my life. The real estate investment paperwork described a strategy for purchasing rental properties that would generate steady income while building equity for my future financial stability.
The trust documentation was the most sophisticated, establishing a legal structure that would supposedly protect my assets from potential creditors, lawsuits, or financial emergencies, while ensuring that funds would always be available for my legitimate needs. The trust agreement included provisions for regular distributions to cover my living expenses and medical costs, with the trustees having broad discretion to determine
Appropriate uses for the funds. On paper, all of these financial arrangements appeared to be carefully designed for my benefit. The investment strategies were conservative and appropriate for someone in my situation. The real estate investments offered potential for steady income and long-term growth. The trust structure provided legal protections and professional management that could be valuable for someone managing a large settlement. However, the critical issue was that none of these financial arrangements had been established with my knowledge or explicit consent. While my family had discussed various investment options and financial planning strategies, I had never agreed to transfer my entire settlement into accounts that I couldn't access or control independently. Mrs. Peterson explained that because Mom was a joint account holder with full access rights, the bank considered all the transfers to be authorized transactions. Even though the amounts were substantial and the transfers had essentially emptied my accounts, the bank had no legal obligation to seek additional confirmation or notify me about the transactions. When I asked about options for recovering the transferred funds, Mrs. Peterson's expression became even more uncomfortable. Since the transfers had been made by an authorized account holder to accounts that appeared to be established for my benefit, this was likely a civil matter rather than a criminal case of theft or fraud. Recovery would probably require legal action against my family members to challenge the legitimacy of the financial arrangements they had created. I left the bank feeling completely devastated and betrayed. The family members who had supported me through the most difficult period of my life had systematically planned and executed the transfer of my entire settlement without my knowledge or consent. The money that was supposed to represent justice for my father's death and security for my future had been placed beyond my reach by the people I trusted most. David accompanied me to an emergency consultation with Attorney Thompson that same afternoon. Thompson reviewed all the documentation from the bank and the account opening paperwork for the various investments and trust arrangements. His analysis confirmed my worst fears about the legal complexity of recovering funds that had been transferred by an authorized joint account holder into financial arrangements that appeared legitimate on their face. Thompson explained that while my family's actions were ethically questionable, proving legal fraud or theft would be challenging since they had technical authority to make the transfers and could argue that all the financial arrangements were intended for my benefit. The investment accounts and trust structures were sophisticated enough that they appeared to be the result of professional financial planning rather than obvious attempts to steal my money. However, Thompson also pointed out that establishing these financial arrangements without my explicit consent could potentially be challenged as breaches of fiduciary duty or constructive fraud, particularly if it could be demonstrated that my family had deceived me about their intentions or had acted primarily for their own benefit rather than mine. The legal options for recovery were complex and uncertain, but Thompson recommended immediate action to freeze the transferred funds and prevent any further transactions that might make recovery more difficult. He offered to file emergency motions seeking temporary restraining orders and asset preservation orders that would prevent my family from accessing or transferring the funds while legal proceedings were pending. Thompson also recommended hiring a forensic accountant to analyze all the financial transactions and investigate whether my family had received any personal benefits from the investment arrangements they had established. If it could be proven that they had structured these accounts to provide themselves with access to settlement funds or had received any compensation for establishing these arrangements, it would strengthen the case for recovery. The emotional devastation of discovering my family's betrayal was almost worse than the financial loss. These were the same people who had held my hand through months of physical therapy, who had driven me to countless medical appointments, who had seemed genuinely concerned about my recovery and future well-being. Learning that they had been planning to take my settlement money while providing this support felt like discovering that my entire family was an elaborate deception. That evening, I confronted Mom and Tony at Mom's house, bringing David and copies of all the bank transfer documentation. Their reaction to my discovery revealed just how carefully they had planned this betrayal and how prepared they were to justify their actions. Mom immediately began explaining that everything they had done was for my protection and benefit. She claimed that leaving such a large amount of money Checking accounts was financially irresponsible and that they had acted quickly to protect my settlement from poor investment decisions or potential financial predators who might try to take advantage of my inexperience with large sums of money. Tony supported Mom's explanation with detailed presentations about the investment returns and tax advantages I would receive through the financial arrangements they had established. He argued that their actions had already saved me thousands of dollars in potential losses and had positioned my settlement for optimal growth and protection over the long term. Rebecca joined the conversation, emphasizing the trust structure's legal protections and the careful consideration they had given to ensuring that funds would always be available for my legitimate needs. She pointed out that the trust included provisions for regular distributions that would actually provide me with more spending money than I would have had if the settlement had remained in checking accounts earning minimal interest. Their explanations were sophisticated and detailed, clearly the result of extensive planning and professional consultation. However, none of their justifications addressed the fundamental issue that they had taken control of my money without my knowledge or consent. When I pointed this out, their responses revealed the true nature of their motivations. Mom became defensive, arguing that I had been making poor financial decisions and that my inexperience with managing large sums of money made family intervention necessary for my own protection. She claimed that my resistance to their investment recommendations had demonstrated that I wasn't prepared to handle the responsibility of managing the settlement independently. Tony's response was more aggressive, suggesting that my settlement money was partially the result of family support during my recovery and that family financial planning was a reasonable expectation given everything they had contributed to achieving this legal victory. He implied that my desire for independent control over the settlement was selfish and ungrateful considering how much the family had sacrificed to support me. Rebecca attempted to mediate by emphasizing the legitimate benefits of the financial arrangements they had established, but her arguments revealed that she was fully aware of and supportive of the decision to transfer my funds without my consent. She suggested that my anger was based on misunderstanding rather than legitimate grievance and that time would prove the wisdom of their financial planning decisions. David's presence during this confrontation seemed to irritate my family members, and they repeatedly suggested that his influence was partly responsible for my negative reaction to their financial planning efforts. Mom implied that David was encouraging me to be suspicious of family members who had my best interests at heart, while Tony more directly accused David of wanting access to my settlement money for his own purposes. The conversation became increasingly heated as it became clear that my family had no intention of returning control of my settlement funds or acknowledging that their actions constituted a betrayal of trust. They seemed genuinely convinced that they had acted appropriately and that my objections were unreasonable and ungrateful. When I threatened legal action to recover my funds, their responses revealed how thoroughly they had prepared for this possibility. Tony mentioned that any legal challenge would be expensive and uncertain, potentially costing more in attorney fees than could be recovered through litigation. Mom pointed out that family legal battles would be publicly embarrassing and would damage relationships that could never be fully repaired. Rebecca suggested that pursuing legal action against family members who had acted in good faith to protect my financial interests would be ethically questionable and would demonstrate poor judgment that would support their arguments about my inability to manage the settlement responsibly. Their coordinated response to my threat of legal action made it clear that they had anticipated this possibility and had planned their justifications accordingly. The sophistication of their financial arrangements and their prepared arguments suggested that this betrayal had been carefully orchestrated over weeks or months while they maintained the pretense of supportive family relationships. The confrontation ended with no resolution and with my family firmly committed to maintaining control over my settlement funds through the financial arrangements they had established without my consent. As David and I left Mom's house that evening, I realized that recovering my money would require treating my family members as adversaries rather than relatives, and that the legal battle ahead would likely destroy any possibility of maintaining family relationships. 3 days later, Attorney Thompson filed emergency motions seeking the return of my settlement funds and the dissolution of the financial arrangements my family had established without my consent. The legal documents detailed the systematic betrayal of trust and requested immediate court intervention to prevent further dissipation of assets that rightfully belonged to me. The legal proceedings that followed were complex and emotionally devastating, requiring detailed investigation of my family's actions and extensive litigation to challenge the sophisticated financial arrangements they had created. However, the story of how justice was ultimately achieved and how I rebuilt my life after this profound betrayal deserves its own telling. What I learned through this experience was that betrayal by family members who are supposed to love and protect you creates a unique kind of devastation that goes beyond financial loss. The people who had supported me through my darkest hours had been planning to steal my future security while maintaining the pretense of caring relationships. But I also learned that even the most sophisticated betrayals can be challenged when you have the courage to fight for what is rightfully yours and when you find allies who will stand with you against those who would exploit your vulnerability. The settlement money that was stolen from me was eventually recovered, but the real victory was reclaiming my independence and learning to trust my own judgment about who deserves a place in my life. Recovery from this betrayal required rebuilding not just my financial security but also my faith in my ability to recognize genuine support versus manipulation disguised as love. The family who stole my settlement taught me valuable lessons about setting boundaries and protecting myself from those who would exploit family relationships for personal gain. The woman who discovered that her family had stolen her future learned to build a new future based on authentic relationships and genuine independence. Sometimes the greatest betrayals lead to the most important discoveries about your own strength and resilience. The knock on my apartment door came at 9:15 on a Tuesday evening, 3 weeks after I had filed the emergency motions to recover my stolen settlement. I wasn't expecting anyone, and David had gone to his evening software development class. Through the peephole, I could see a well-dressed man in his 50s holding a leather briefcase, looking nothing like the process servers or court officials I had been dreading would eventually appear at my door. When I opened the door with the chain still attached, the man introduced himself as attorney Michael Thompson, but not the same Thompson who had handled my personal injury case. This Michael Thompson specialized in financial fraud and asset recovery, and he had heard about my situation through professional networks in the Phoenix legal community. He asked if he could come in to discuss a proposition that might help me recover my stolen funds more effectively than traditional litigation. My initial reaction was suspicion. After everything I had experienced with my family's elaborate deception, I was wary of anyone who appeared unexpectedly offering solutions that seemed too good to be true. However, Thompson's credentials were impressive, and his knowledge of the specific details of my case suggested that he had done substantial research before approaching me. Thompson explained that he had built his practice around cases involving family financial abuse, particularly situations where trusted relatives used their access to exploit vulnerable family members for financial gain. He had developed specialized strategies for proving constructive fraud and breach of fiduciary duty in cases where traditional theft charges were difficult to pursue due to technical authorization issues. What made Thompson's approach unique was his willingness to work on contingency fee arrangements for clients who had been financially devastated by family betrayal. He understood that victims of family financial abuse often lacked the resources to pursue expensive litigation against well-prepared defendants who had stolen their money and used those same funds to hire sophisticated legal representation. Thompson had reviewed the public records related to my emergency motions and had identified several strategic weaknesses in my family's financial arrangements that could be exploited to prove fraudulent intent and recover my settlement funds. He believed that with proper investigation and aggressive litigation tactics, he could not only recover my stolen money but also pursue additional damages for the intentional infliction of emotional distress and punitive damages for particularly egregious conduct. His confidence was compelling, but I had learned to be cautious about trusting legal professionals who made aggressive promises about outcomes in complex cases. When I asked for references from previous clients, Thompson provided contact information for 3 individuals who had successfully recovered substantial sums from family members who had exploited their trust for financial gain. The phone conversations with Thompson's former clients were revealing and encouraging. Each person described situations remarkably similar to mine, involving trusted family members who had gained access to significant funds and then used sophisticated financial arrangements to maintain control while claiming to act in the victim's best interests. All 3 had successfully recovered their stolen assets through Thompson's aggressive litigation strategies. More importantly, all 3 emphasized Thompson's understanding of the emotional devastation involved in family financial betrayal and his commitment to achieving not just financial recovery but also personal vindication for clients who had been systematically deceived by people they loved and trusted. After careful consideration and consultation with David, I decided to retain Thompson's services to pursue recovery of my settlement funds. His contingency fee arrangement meant that I wouldn't have to pay attorney fees unless he successfully recovered my money, which was crucial since my family's theft had left me with limited financial resources to pursue litigation. Thompson's first step was conducting a comprehensive forensic investigation of all financial transactions related to my settlement and the various accounts my family had established. He hired a team of financial investigators and forensic accountants who specialized in tracing assets and identifying hidden benefits or personal gains that defendants might have received from supposedly legitimate financial arrangements. The investigation revealed disturbing details about my family's planning and execution of their scheme to control my settlement money. Email communications between Tony and financial advisors showed that they had been researching strategies for gaining control over my settlement funds for months before the money was actually received. The communications revealed that their primary concern was ensuring that I wouldn't be able to access or control the funds independently. The forensic analysis of the investment accounts and trust arrangements revealed that my family had structured these accounts to provide themselves with significant access and control while maintaining plausible arguments about acting for my benefit. Tony had been designated as the primary decision-maker for the investment account with authority to make withdrawals and investment changes without my approval or notification. Mom had established the real estate investment account with herself as the sole manager, giving her complete control over property purchases, rental income, and eventual sale proceeds. The trust arrangement was even more problematic, structured in a way that gave the trustees broad discretion to determine what constituted appropriate distributions while providing no meaningful oversight or accountability mechanisms. Most damaging was the discovery that my family had received direct financial benefits from these arrangements that they had never disclosed to me. Tony had negotiated fee arrangements with the investment firm that provided him with commissions on transactions and ongoing management fees. Mom had structured the real estate investments to include management fees payable to herself for overseeing the properties. The trust arrangement included provisions for trustee compensation that would provide regular payments to Mom, Tony, and Rebecca for their services in managing my funds. None of these compensation arrangements had been disclosed to me, and they represented clear conflicts of interest that undermined any claims that my family had acted solely for my benefit. Thompson used this evidence to file amended legal pleadings that dramatically expanded the scope of our claims against my family. In addition to seeking return of the stolen settlement funds, we now sought punitive damages for fraud, restitution for the undisclosed compensation my family had received, and attorney fees based on their bad faith conduct. The amended lawsuit also included claims for intentional infliction of emotional distress, arguing that my family's systematic deception and exploitation of my trust during my recovery from devastating injuries constituted particularly egregious conduct that warranted additional damages beyond simple financial recovery. My family's response to the expanded lawsuit revealed just how seriously they took Thompson's aggressive litigation strategy. They retained a prestigious law firm that specialized in defending against financial fraud claims, indicating that they were prepared to spend significant resources fighting our efforts to recover my settlement money. Their defense strategy focused on portraying their actions as well-intentioned financial planning that had been mischaracterized as fraud due to my emotional instability and David's manipulative influence. They argued that the investment arrangements they had established were financially beneficial and professionally managed, providing me with better returns and protection than I could have achieved independently. My family's attorneys also attempted to characterize my legal challenge as an ungrateful attack on family members who had sacrificed extensively to support my recovery and had acted in good faith to protect my financial interests. They portrayed me as an emotionally unstable person who was being manipulated by outsiders who wanted access to my settlement money for their own purposes. However, Thompson's investigation had uncovered enough evidence of self-dealing and undisclosed conflicts of interest that my family's claims of good faith became increasingly difficult to maintain. The evidence of their financial benefits from the arrangements they had established, combined with their systematic concealment of these benefits, supported strong claims for fraudulent conduct. The discovery process in the lawsuit revealed additional evidence of my family's deceptive planning and coordination. Text messages between Mom and Tony showed detailed discussions about how to maintain my trust while ensuring that I wouldn't be able to challenge their control over my settlement funds. Email communications with their attorneys showed that they had been planning their defense strategy before I even discovered the theft. Most damaging were recorded phone conversations between Tony and Rebecca discussing strategies for justifying their actions if I discovered what they had done. The recordings obtained through Thompson's investigation of phone records included explicit acknowledgments that they knew I would be angry about their actions and detailed planning about how to present their financial arrangements as legitimate and beneficial.
These recordings provided direct evidence that my family understood their actions would be seen as betrayals of trust and that they had deliberately planned to deceive me about their intentions and motivations. The evidence made it impossible for them to maintain credible claims that they had acted in good faith or that their primary concern had been my financial well-being. As the strength of our evidence became apparent, my family's legal strategy shifted toward settlement negotiations rather than continued litigation. Their attorneys approached Thompson about resolving the case through confidential mediation that would avoid the public exposure and family embarrassment that would result from a trial. Thompson was initially skeptical of settlement discussions, believing that we had strong enough evidence to achieve complete victory through trial and that my family deserved public accountability for their systematic fraud. However, he also recognized that settlement might provide faster recovery of my stolen funds and would avoid the emotional toll of extended litigation against family members. The mediation process revealed just how thoroughly my family's scheme had been planned and executed. Under pressure from the mediator and faced with overwhelming evidence of their fraud, they eventually admitted that their primary motivation had been gaining control over my settlement money rather than protecting my financial interests. Tony acknowledged that he had seen my settlement as an opportunity to improve his own financial situation through the commissions and fees he would receive from managing the investment accounts. Mom admitted that she had planned to use the real estate investments to benefit herself and other family members, not just to generate income for my care. Rebecca's role had been primarily supportive, but she acknowledged knowing about the undisclosed compensation arrangements and helping to plan the deceptive justifications they would use if I discovered their actions. Her participation in the scheme was less financially motivated but equally damaging to the trust I had placed in family relationships. The mediation resulted in a comprehensive settlement agreement that required my family to return all stolen settlement funds plus interest and penalties. They also had to pay additional damages for the emotional distress they had caused and reimburse all attorney fees and investigation costs I had incurred in recovering my money. More importantly, the settlement agreement included provisions that prohibited my family from having any future involvement in my financial affairs and required them to acknowledge in writing that their actions had constituted fraud and breach of trust. While these acknowledgments were confidential as part of the settlement, they provided personal vindication for the betrayal I had experienced. The recovery of my settlement funds took several months to complete, as the various accounts and investments had to be liquidated and the proceeds transferred back to accounts under my sole control. Thompson ensured that all transactions were properly documented and that my family had no remaining access to any accounts or investments that had been established with my stolen money. During this recovery process, I worked with a different financial advisor who specialized in serving clients who had experienced financial trauma. This advisor helped me establish investment strategies that prioritized security and liquidity while providing reasonable returns on my recovered settlement funds. More importantly, this advisor helped me understand the warning signs of financial manipulation and exploitation that I had missed during my family's systematic deception. I learned about the importance of maintaining independent control over financial accounts and the risks of allowing family members to have excessive involvement in major financial decisions. The emotional recovery from my family's betrayal was more challenging than the financial recovery. Learning that the people I trusted most had systematically planned to steal my future security while maintaining the pretense of loving support created lasting damage to my ability to trust family relationships and close personal connections. Therapy became essential for processing the complex emotions involved in discovering that my family's support during my medical recovery had been conditional on their ability to exploit my vulnerability for financial gain. The realization that their expressions of love and concern had been part of an elaborate deception was more devastating than the financial theft itself. However, the experience also taught me valuable lessons about recognizing genuine support versus manipulation disguised as care. I learned to value relationships based on respect for my independence and autonomy rather than expressions of concern that came with expectations of control over my decisions. David's unwavering support throughout this ordeal proved the difference between manipulative relationships and genuine partnership. His consistent respect for my autonomy and his willingness to support my decisions even when they conflicted with family expectations demonstrated the kind of authentic love I had mistaken for normal family dynamics. The successful recovery of my settlement funds allowed me to rebuild my financial security on my own terms, with investment strategies that prioritized my goals and values rather than other people's ideas about what was best for me. The money that had been stolen became the foundation for genuine independence rather than a source of family control and manipulation. Thompson's aggressive representation had achieved more than financial recovery. His willingness to pursue my case when other attorneys had been hesitant
Challenge sophisticated financial fraud provided a model for standing up to exploitation, even when it comes from people who are supposed to love and protect you. The woman who discovered that her family had stolen her future learned to build new relationships based on mutual respect and genuine concern rather than conditional support that came with hidden agendas. Sometimes the greatest betrayals create opportunities to discover what authentic love and support actually look like. Recovery meant more than getting my money back. It meant learning to trust my own judgment about who deserves access to my life and my resources. The settlement that was supposed to represent justice for my father's death and security for my future ultimately became the foundation for a life built on truth rather than manipulation. The family who stole my settlement money taught me that blood relationships don't guarantee loyalty or trustworthiness. But they also taught me that my own strength and determination could overcome even the most sophisticated betrayals when I had the courage to fight for what was rightfully mine. 8 months after recovering my stolen settlement, I found myself standing in the lobby of a gleaming office building in downtown Phoenix, waiting to meet with Sarah Chen about a business opportunity that would transform my understanding of what my life could become. The money that had been stolen and recovered was now safely invested in conservative portfolios under my sole control, but I had discovered that financial security alone wasn't enough to heal the wounds left by my family's betrayal. Sarah had contacted me through attorney Thompson, who had shared my story with colleagues in the legal community as an example of successful asset recovery in family fraud cases. As a victims' rights advocate who specialized in helping people rebuild after financial exploitation, Sarah had been impressed by my determination to pursue justice despite the emotional cost of fighting my own family members. Sarah's organization, Phoenix Rising Financial Recovery, provided counseling and practical support for individuals who had experienced financial abuse from trusted relatives or intimate partners. She had built the program after her own experience with financial exploitation by a manipulative spouse who had systematically gained control over her assets before abandoning her with massive debts and destroyed credit. The opportunity Sarah presented was both challenging and inspiring. She wanted me to consider joining her organization as a peer counselor and advocate, using my experience with family financial fraud to help other victims navigate the complex legal and emotional challenges of recovery. The position would involve training in trauma-informed counseling techniques and specialized knowledge about asset recovery strategies. What made Sarah's offer particularly meaningful was her understanding that victims of family financial abuse often struggled with feelings of shame and self-blame that made recovery more difficult than other types of financial crimes. When strangers steal your money, the violation is clear and the emotional processing is straightforward. When family members exploit your trust for personal gain, the betrayal creates complex trauma that affects your ability to form healthy relationships and make confident financial decisions. My experience with my family's systematic deception had given me insights into the psychological manipulation tactics that financial abusers use to maintain control over their victims. I understood how expressions of love and concern could be weaponized to prevent victims from questioning suspicious financial arrangements or seeking independent advice about major decisions. During my initial training with Phoenix Rising, I learned that my family's behavior had followed predictable patterns that were common in financial abuse cases. The gradual escalation of control, the creation of financial dependency, the use of professional-appearing documentation to legitimize theft, and the coordinated gaslighting when confronted were all standard techniques used by financial predators who exploited family relationships. Understanding that my experience was part of a recognizable pattern helped reduce the self-blame and shame I had been carrying about being deceived by people I loved. I realized that financial abusers often target family members who are vulnerable due to medical crises, legal settlements, inheritances, or other circumstances that create both opportunity and justification for increased involvement in financial affairs. My first case as a peer counselor involved Maria Santos, a 68-year-old widow whose adult children had convinced her to sign over power of attorney during a brief hospitalization for heart surgery. Within weeks of gaining legal control over her finances, her children had sold her house, liquidated her retirement accounts, and moved her into a substandard assisted living facility while keeping the proceeds from her assets for themselves. Maria's situation was both heartbreaking and familiar. Her children had justified their actions by claiming that she was no longer capable of managing her finances independently and that they were protecting her from potential scams or poor financial decisions. They had used her temporary medical vulnerability to establish permanent control over her assets, then systematically stripped away her financial independence while maintaining the pretense that everything was being done for her protection. Working with Maria taught me how financial abuse often escalates gradually, with each boundary violation being justified as necessary protection or family assistance. Her children had begun by offering to help with bill paying during her recovery, then progressed to making investment decisions on her behalf, and eventually gained complete control over her assets through legal documents she had signed without fully understanding their implications. The emotional manipulation Maria described was almost identical to what I had experienced with my own family. Her children had used her love for them and her desire to maintain family harmony to prevent her from questioning their increasingly controlling behavior. They had characterized any resistance or desire for independence as evidence of mental decline that justified their continued control over her finances. Maria's recovery process required not only legal action to challenge the power of attorney arrangements but also extensive counseling to address the trauma of being systematically betrayed by her own children. Like me, she struggled with feelings of guilt and shame about being deceived, often blaming herself for trusting people who had exploited her vulnerability for personal gain. Through working with Maria and other clients, I developed a deeper understanding of how financial abuse damages victims' ability to trust their own judgment about relationships and financial decisions. The systematic gaslighting and manipulation that accompanies financial theft creates lasting psychological effects that extend far beyond the immediate financial losses. My second major case involved David Rodriguez, a 35-year-old construction worker who had received a substantial workers' compensation settlement after being injured in a workplace accident. His brother had convinced him to invest the settlement in a family construction business that turned out to be a sophisticated scheme to transfer David's money into accounts controlled by extended family members. David's case was particularly complex because the family business appeared legitimate on the surface, with proper incorporation documents, business bank accounts, and even some actual construction contracts. However, forensic investigation revealed that the business was structured primarily to funnel David's settlement money to family members through inflated salaries, questionable expense reimbursements, and management fees that provided no real value. The emotional aspects of David's case were as challenging as the financial recovery efforts. His family had convinced him that investing in the family business was a way to honor his deceased father's memory and provide employment opportunities for relatives who were struggling financially. They had used his sense of family loyalty and his desire to help others as weapons to justify their exploitation of his settlement funds. Working with David reinforced my understanding that financial abusers often use victims' positive qualities against them. My family had exploited my gratitude for their support during my recovery, just as David's family had exploited his generosity and desire to help struggling relatives. Maria's children had exploited her love for them and her desire to maintain family relationships. The success we achieved in recovering David's stolen funds required aggressive legal action combined with careful emotional support to help him process the betrayal and develop healthy boundaries with family members who had exploited his trust. Like my own case, David's recovery involved not just getting his money back but learning to recognize and protect himself from future manipulation attempts. As my experience with Phoenix Rising expanded, I began developing specialized training materials for other advocates working with family financial abuse cases. The training focused on recognizing the unique psychological dynamics involved when trusted family members exploit their relationships for financial gain, and the specialized recovery strategies needed to address both the financial and emotional aspects of these crimes. One of the most important concepts I learned to teach was the difference between legitimate family financial cooperation and exploitative financial control. Healthy family financial relationships involve transparency, mutual respect for autonomy, and clear boundaries around decision-making authority. Financial abuse involves secrecy, manipulation, gradual erosion of independence, and the use of emotional manipulation to prevent victims from seeking help or questioning suspicious arrangements. My work with Phoenix Rising also involved advocacy efforts to improve legal protections for victims of family financial abuse. Many existing laws were designed to address financial crimes committed by strangers and didn't adequately address the unique challenges involved when family members exploit their trusted relationships for financial gain. We worked with state legislators to develop stronger penalties for financial abuse committed by family members and to create specialized court procedures that recognize the complex emotional dynamics involved in these cases. We also advocated for improved training for law enforcement officers and court personnel to help them understand why victims of family financial abuse often initially resist prosecution efforts or express ambivalence about pursuing legal remedies. The advocacy work was personally meaningful because it addressed many of the obstacles I had encountered during my own recovery process. Law enforcement officers had initially been skeptical about pursuing criminal charges against my family because the financial arrangements they had created appeared sophisticated and legitimate. Court personnel had difficulty understanding why I was so devastated by actions that could be characterized as misguided financial planning rather than deliberate theft. Education about the psychological manipulation tactics used by financial abusers helped legal professionals understand why victims often appeared confused or conflicted about pursuing recovery efforts. The trauma bonding that occurs in abusive family relationships creates complex emotional responses that can make victims seem unreliable or unstable when they are actually demonstrating normal responses to systematic psychological manipulation. My personal relationship with David evolved significantly during this period of professional growth and advocacy work. His unwavering support during my legal battle with my family had demonstrated his commitment to our relationship, but my recovery process had also revealed the importance of maintaining independence and avoiding codependent relationship patterns. David and I decided to formalize our commitment through marriage, but we approached this decision with careful attention to maintaining the healthy boundaries and mutual respect that had sustained our relationship through crisis. We established prenuptial agreements that protected our individual assets and clearly defined our separate financial responsibilities, ensuring that our marriage would be based on emotional partnership rather than financial dependency. Our wedding was small and intimate, attended by friends and colleagues from my advocacy work rather than family members who had proven themselves untrustworthy. The absence of my biological family was initially painful, but it also represented freedom from relationships that had been based on manipulation and control rather than genuine love and support. The community we built through Phoenix Rising and our advocacy work provided the supportive relationships that healthy families should offer. These relationships were based on mutual respect, shared values, and genuine concern for each other's well-being rather than expectations of control or access to personal resources. 2 years after my recovery, I received an unexpected letter from Tony, my brother who had been the primary architect of the scheme to steal my settlement money. The letter was an apology that acknowledged the harm he had caused and expressed regret for exploiting my trust during my recovery from devastating injuries. Tony's letter revealed that the consequences of their actions had extended beyond the legal and financial penalties we had imposed through the lawsuit. The exposure of their systematic fraud had damaged their reputations in the community and had created conflict within extended family relationships. Rebecca had eventually left Tony, unable to reconcile her conscience with her participation in exploiting my vulnerability. Mom had developed health problems that Tony attributed to stress and guilt about their actions. The family relationships that had seemed so important when they were justifying their theft had been damaged beyond repair by the revelation of their willingness to exploit and deceive each other for financial gain. Tony's letter included an offer to meet and discuss the possibility of rebuilding some form of family relationship, acknowledging that this would require accepting accountability for their actions and respecting boundaries I might establish to protect myself from future exploitation. While his apology seemed genuine, I was no longer interested in maintaining relationships with people who had proven themselves capable of such systematic betrayal. My response to Tony was brief and clear. I acknowledged his apology but explained that I had built a new life based on authentic relationships and had no interest in reconnecting with family members who had exploited my trust for personal gain. The emotional energy I had once invested in trying to maintain family harmony was now directed toward helping other victims of financial abuse and building relationships based on mutual respect and genuine care. The decision to permanently separate from my biological family was difficult but liberating. It represented a final break from the toxic relationship patterns that had made their exploitation possible and cleared space for healthier connections based on shared values rather than genetic relationships or historical obligations. 5 years after my settlement was stolen and recovered, I had built a career that gave meaning to the suffering I had experienced and had created a life based on authentic relationships rather than manipulative family dynamics. My work with Phoenix Rising had helped dozens of financial abuse victims recover their stolen assets and rebuild their lives with stronger boundaries and better self-protection skills. The money that had been stolen from me had been fully recovered with interest and penalties, providing financial security that allowed me to focus on advocacy work rather than simply surviving. However, the real victory was not the financial recovery but the personal transformation that had occurred through the process of fighting for justice and helping others do the same.
The woman who had once apologized for existing too loudly in her family's presence had become an advocate who helped other victims find their voices and demand accountability from those who had exploited their trust. The experience of being systematically betrayed by people who claimed to love me had taught me to recognize and value authentic relationships while protecting myself from those who would exploit vulnerability for personal gain. My marriage to David was thriving because it was based on mutual respect and shared values rather than the toxic dynamics I had mistaken for normal family relationships. Our home was a place of safety and support where both of us could pursue our individual goals while building something meaningful together. The work I did with Phoenix Rising gave purpose to my suffering and provided hope for other victims that recovery was possible even from the most sophisticated betrayals. Every case we won, every dollar we recovered, every victim who learned to trust their own judgment again represented a victory over the predators who exploit family relationships for personal gain. The family who stole my settlement money had intended to control my future for their own benefit. Instead, their betrayal had freed me to build a life based on my own values and choices, supported by relationships that honored my independence rather than seeking to exploit my vulnerability. Sometimes the greatest betrayals create opportunities for the most profound healing and growth. The money they stole was recovered, but more importantly, I had recovered myself. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.